Mrs. Evelyn Carter had been teaching high school English for over 20 years, and she had seen her fair share of students come and go. Yet something about Daniel Turner stood out to her. He was 16, lanky, with messy brown hair that always seemed to flop into his eyes. Daniel wasn't particularly talkative, and when he did speak, his voice carried the weight of someone far older. Most of his classmates barely noticed him, but Mrs. Carter could tell he was struggling in ways they couldn't see. It was during the first week of October that Mrs. Carter started paying closer attention to him. She had assigned a basic essay about students' future aspirations, and while most of the class had handed in their papers on time, Daniel's was missing. She waited until after class to ask him about it. "Daniel, can we talk for a moment?" she said as the other students filtered out of the room. He froze, his shoulders stiffening. "Yeah. I noticed you didn't turn in your essay. Is everything all right?" His eyes darted to the floor. I forgot." Mrs. Carter didn't push him. Instead, she nodded gently. "If you need more time, just let me know." But Daniel didn't ask for more time. Over the next few weeks, his missing assignments began to pile up, and when he did manage to turn something in, it was rushed and incomplete. Mrs. Carter couldn't ignore it any longer. She decided to look into the matter, starting with a quiet conversation with the school counselor. What she learned broke her heart. Daniel's mother worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, and his father had left the family years ago. On top of that, Daniel often had to take care of his younger sister, Emma, after school, leaving little time for homework. Their financial situation was dire, and Mrs. Carter realized that Daniel wasn't just struggling with academics, he was carrying the weight of his family on his young shoulders. The next day, Mrs. Carter approached him during lunch. She set a tray of food down on the table and sat across from him. "I wanted to check in with you," she said, her tone soft but firm. "I know you've got a lot on your plate right now." Daniel looked up from his half-eaten sandwich, surprised by her presence. "I'm fine. I think you're stronger than most people realize. But even the strongest people need help sometimes." For a moment, Daniel didn't say anything. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he admitted, There's so much going on. I don't have time for schoolwork. And when I do, I can't think straight. My mom's always working, and Emma. She needs me." Mrs. Carter nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "Would it be all right if I helped you out a bit? We could work together after school. I can tutor you in English, and if there's anything else you're struggling with, we'll tackle it one step at a time." Daniel hesitated, but eventually he nodded. "Okay, I guess that would help." That evening, Mrs. Carter went to a nearby store and bought a set of notebooks, pens, and highlighters. She added a few binders and a sturdy backpack to her cart. The next day, she handed them to Daniel. "These are for you," she said, watching as his eyes widened. "Every student deserves the tools they need to succeed." Daniel took the supplies slowly, as though he couldn't believe they were really his. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. From that point on, Mrs. Carter stayed after school with Daniel 3 times a week. They worked on essay structures, practiced grammar, and brainstormed ideas for projects. She encouraged him to find ways to express himself, even if writing wasn't his favorite thing. "Don't worry about being perfect," she would tell him. "The important thing is to keep trying." As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's grades began to improve. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the small victories started to add up. One day, he turned in an essay about his sister and how much he admired her resilience. When Mrs. Carter handed it back with a scrawled at the top, he grinned for the first time she could remember. Outside of school, things were still hard for Daniel. His mother's long hours meant he was often responsible for cooking dinner and helping Emma with her homework. Money was tight, and there were nights when he fell asleep at the kitchen table, exhausted from balancing it all. But he now had someone in his corner, someone who believed in him. One afternoon, after their tutoring session, Daniel lingered by the classroom door. Mrs. Carter, he asked. Yes, Daniel. Why are you doing all this? You don't have to, but you care. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. Because I see potential in you, Daniel. And I want you to see it too. As Daniel walked home that day, carrying the backpack she had given him, he felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The crisp air of winter brought challenges for Daniel, but also a newfound determination. Since Mrs. Carter had started tutoring him, he felt like someone had finally seen beyond his circumstances and believed in him. That belief sparked something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Still, there was no denying the weight of his struggles at home. Each evening, Daniel returned to a tiny 2-bedroom apartment where the heater barely worked, and the cupboards often held more empty space than food. His mother, exhausted after back-to-back shifts, would kiss him on the forehead before collapsing onto the couch. Daniel would put on a brave face for Emma, helping her with her math homework or braiding her hair before bed, but inside he felt the pressure mounting. At school, though, things were changing. Slowly but surely, Daniel's confidence grew. Mrs. Carter's tutoring sessions weren't just about grammar rules or essay outlines. She also taught him how to manage his time, how to break big tasks into smaller, manageable steps. One day, she handed him a small planner and encouraged him to use it. Write down what you need to do each day, she explained. Even if it's just 1 or 2 things, you'll feel more in control. Daniel tried it, and to his surprise, it worked. He started jotting down assignments and checking them off as he completed them. It wasn't perfect, there were still nights when exhaustion won out, but it gave him a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt before. Mrs. Carter also went beyond academics, encouraging him to think about his future. One afternoon she asked, "Have you ever thought about what you'd like to do after high school?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. I mean, college sounds nice, but we don't have the money for that." "Money isn't the only way to get there," Mrs. Carter said. "There are scholarships, grants, and people who want to help students like you succeed. And college isn't the only option. The important thing is finding something you're passionate about." Passion. That word stuck with Daniel. It wasn't something he'd ever really considered. His days had always been about survival, about getting through the next hurdle. But now, the idea of pursuing something he loved felt like a seed taking root. One day, during a tutoring session, Mrs. Carter asked him about his interests. "What do you enjoy? What makes you curious?" Daniel thought for a moment. "I like figuring things out, fixing stuff. Like when Emma's tablet stopped working, I watched a video and figured out how to fix it." Mrs. Carter's eyes lit up. "That's a valuable skill, Daniel. Have you ever thought about technology? Computers, coding, engineering?" He shook his head. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "Starting is the hardest part," she said with a smile. "But I think you'd be great at it." Encouraged by her words, Daniel began exploring. He spent hours at the library, borrowing books about basic coding and technology. He didn't understand everything at first, but he didn't let that stop him. Mrs. Carter even connected him with Mr. Patel, the school's teacher, who agreed to teach Daniel the basics of programming after school. At first, Daniel struggled with the unfamiliar language of coding, but he soon realized it was like solving puzzles, something he had always enjoyed. As he pieced together lines of code and saw his efforts come to life on a computer screen, a sense of pride swelled within him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter continued to provide quiet but steady support. When Daniel's sneakers began to fall apart, she left a new pair in his locker with a note that simply said, "Keep going, you're doing amazing." When Emma needed help with a school project and Daniel didn't have the supplies, Mrs. Carter discreetly provided what they needed. These gestures weren't grand, but to Daniel, they meant the world. By spring, Daniel's grades had improved significantly. His English teacher, once skeptical of his potential, praised his efforts in front of the class. For the first time, Daniel didn't shrink away from the attention. Instead, he allowed himself a small, proud smile. But progress wasn't always linear. There were setbacks days when the stress of home life threatened to derail him. One afternoon he showed up to a tutoring session visibly upset. Mrs. Carter didn't push him to talk, but as they worked, he finally blurted out, "It's just so hard sometimes. No matter how much I try, it feels like I'll never get ahead." Mrs. Carter set down her pen and looked at him with compassion. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed, Daniel. You're carrying so much, and it's not fair that you have to grow up so fast. But I want you to remember this: you are not alone. There are people who care about you, who believe in you, and you have the strength to keep going, even when it feels impossible." Those words stayed with Daniel. They became a mantra he repeated to himself on the toughest days. By the end of the school year, Daniel had not only passed his classes but excelled in a way that surprised even him. He stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and began to see a future he once thought was out of reach. When Mrs. Carter handed him his final report card, she smiled and said, "I'm so proud of you, Daniel. This is just the beginning." As he walked out of her classroom for the last time that year, Daniel turned back and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter, for everything." Mrs. Carter watched him go, her heart full of hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that Daniel was capable of remarkable things. Sometimes all it took was a spark of kindness to light the way forward. 9 years later, Daniel Turner was unrecognizable from the quiet, overwhelmed boy he had been in Mrs. Carter's class. At 25, he was now the founder and CEO of Turner Tech, a thriving tech company that specialized in software designed to streamline operations for small businesses. Daniel's journey had been anything but smooth, and the road to success was paved with challenges, hard work, and moments of doubt. The turning point had come after high school, but the seeds had been planted long before. Daniel's final years in high school had been transformative. With Mrs. Carter's support, he graduated with grades strong enough to earn a scholarship to the local community college. Though the scholarship covered tuition, it didn't account for living expenses, books, or the realities of helping his family. Daniel worked part-time jobs while juggling his studies and his responsibilities at home, often staying up late to tutor Emma or cook dinner for his exhausted mother. But Daniel had discovered something powerful during those late-night study sessions: an interest in technology. What had started as a passing curiosity grew into a passion. He spent hours teaching himself basic coding using free resources online. He scoured library books and took advantage of free coding workshops offered at the college. It was slow progress at first, but each small success fueled his determination to learn more. By his second year at community college, Daniel had transferred to a university with a computer science program. The transition was daunting, and he often felt like he didn't belong among students who came from more privileged backgrounds. But the lessons Mrs. Carter had taught him about perseverance, about breaking tasks into smaller, manageable steps, helped him push forward. It was during a university internship that Daniel got his first taste of the tech industry. The company he interned for was small, but it had big ambitions. Daniel thrived there, absorbing everything he could about software development and business operations. He started to see how technology could solve real-world problems, and an idea began to form in his mind. After graduation, Daniel returned to his roots, driven by a desire to create something meaningful. His mother's struggles as a working parent had left a lasting impression on him. She had always juggled chaotic schedules, trying to manage her jobs and family with little support. Daniel thought about how many others face similar challenges, and he wanted to make a difference. With a refurbished laptop and a dream, Daniel began developing software designed to help small business owners manage tasks like scheduling, inventory, and communication more efficiently. It wasn't glamorous. His first workspace was a corner of his shared apartment, and his budget was non-existent. He worked long hours, often skipping meals to save money. The first version of his software was simple, but it resonated with a local coffee shop owner who became his first client. That one client turned into 2, then 5. Word spread, and Daniel's dedication and ingenuity caught the attention of a small investor willing to take a chance on him. With funding, he was able to hire a tiny team and refine his product. Over the next few years, Turner Tech grew rapidly. By the time Daniel was 25, the company had become a trusted name in small business solutions, helping thousands of people manage their operations more effectively. Through it all, Daniel never forgot where he came from or the people who had helped him along the way. He often thought of Mrs. Carter, the teacher who had given him school supplies when he had none and had stayed after hours to help him understand subjects that once felt impossible. Her belief in him had lit a fire that carried him through even the darkest times. One day, as Daniel reviewed a quarterly report in his sleek office, he put the papers down and leaned back in his chair. Something was missing. Success was fulfilling, but there was an emptiness that lingered. He realized he needed to thank the person who had sparked his journey. Daniel picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Can you help me track someone down?" he asked. "Her name is Evelyn Carter. She was my high school English teacher. I need to find her." The assistant promised to get started immediately, but the process wasn't instant. Mrs. Carter had retired a few years earlier and was no longer at the school. It took weeks of searching before Daniel received an email from his assistant with Mrs. Carter's contact information and current address. As Daniel read the email, memories of her kindness and encouragement flooded back. He decided it was time to visit her in person and show her just how much she had impacted his life. The next steps would be monumental not just for him, but for the teacher who had once given him hope when he had none. The meeting would close a circle that had started so many years ago in a small, crowded classroom filled with struggle and possibility. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Daniel parked his sleek black car in front of a modest, well-kept home on the outskirts of town. His heart raced as he stepped out, clutching a small gift bag in one hand and an envelope in the other. The address his assistant had provided matched the house number, and he couldn't help but feel a wave of nervousness. Would she even remember him? He approached the door and knocked gently. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Carter. Her hair had turned silver, but her kind eyes were just as warm as he remembered. She blinked, staring at him for a moment before her face broke into a wide smile. "Daniel," she said, her voice tinged with astonishment. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and emotion. "It's been a while." Mrs. Carter stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "Look at you," she said, pulling back to study him. "All grown up. I can't believe it. What brings you here?" "I wanted to see you," Daniel said, his smile soft but sincere. "And I wanted to say thank you." Mrs. Carter invited him inside, guiding him to a cozy living room filled with books and family photos. They sat down and Daniel recounted the years since high school, his struggles in college, the sleepless nights starting his business, and the moment when Turner Tech became successful. He spoke of how her unwavering support had kept him going when he felt like giving up. "You always said I could do more. That I had potential," he said. "You saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself. That's why I'm here to thank you for everything you did." Mrs. Carter wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice full of pride. "Daniel, I'm so glad to hear that. But I always knew you were destined for great things. I just helped you find your way." Daniel shook his head. "You did more than that. And I wanted to show my gratitude in a tangible way." He handed her the small gift bag. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet engraved with the words, "For the teacher who believed in me." Mrs. Carter gasped as she held it in her hands, her eyes welling up. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "There's more," Daniel said, passing her the envelope. Mrs. Carter opened it and found a check for $5,000, along with a handwritten note that read, "You changed my life. This is just a small token of my appreciation for everything you've done, not just for me, but for all the students lucky enough to have you as their teacher." Her hands trembled as she looked at the check. "Daniel, this is... I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "You deserve it. You went above and beyond for me, and I know I wasn't the only one. Teachers like you shape lives in ways you might never see." I just wanted you to know how much it meant to me." Mrs. Carter smiled through her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. It's rare to see the impact we have on students, but moments like this remind me why I became a teacher in the first place. Thank you, Daniel. This means more to me than you'll ever know. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking and reminiscing. Mrs. Carter shared stories about her retirement, her garden, and the students she still thought about. Daniel spoke about Emma, now thriving in her own career, and the plans he had to expand Turner Tech. When it was time for Daniel to leave, Mrs. Carter walked him to the door. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for the person you've become." As Daniel drove away, he felt lighter than he had in years. He knew he could never fully repay Mrs. Carter for the gift of her belief. But he also knew that her kindness had set in motion a legacy that would continue to grow. And Mrs. Carter, standing at her doorway with the bracelet on her wrist and the envelope in her hand, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about the money or the gifts. It was about knowing that one act of kindness, one spark of encouragement, had helped a young man find his way. That knowledge was more precious than anything else. Months passed after Daniel's visit to Mrs. Carter, but the emotions from their reunion stayed with him. The warmth in her voice, the pride in her eyes, these were memories he carried with him as he navigated his busy life. Success had brought him material comforts, but it was moments like these that truly gave it meaning. Mrs. Carter, too, often thought about that day. The gold bracelet with its engraved message had become one of her most cherished possessions, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. She would catch herself smiling whenever she looked at it, remembering the lanky boy with messy hair who had once sat at the back of her classroom, unsure of his future. For Daniel, life continued to accelerate. Turner Tech grew steadily, and his team expanded with brilliant minds who shared his passion for technology. Yet, even as he juggled meetings, product launches, and industry conferences, he found himself craving simpler, quieter moments. One such moment came when he received an invitation from his old high school. They were hosting a career day and had invited him to speak as an alumnus. At first, Daniel hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he loved, and the idea of returning to the school felt surreal. But as he sat with the invitation in hand, he thought about Mrs. Carter and all she had done for him. A week later, Daniel found himself walking through the familiar hallways of the school. The lockers, though repainted, still lined the walls in the same pattern. Memories flooded back: late nights with Mrs. Carter, hurried lunches, and moments of quiet reflection when he wondered if he'd ever find his way. In the auditorium, students buzzed with excitement as the career day event began. Daniel watched as speakers from different professions took the stage, sharing their paths to success. When it was his turn, he stepped forward, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. He began by sharing his story, not the polished, triumphant version, but the raw, honest truth. He talked about the struggles he faced as a teenager, the weight of responsibility at home, and the times he had doubted himself. Then he spoke of Mrs. Carter. "There was a teacher," Daniel said, his voice steady, "who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She bought me school supplies when I couldn't afford them, stayed late to help me understand my assignments, and reminded me that my circumstances didn't define my potential." The room fell silent, the students hanging on his every word. Daniel could see their faces, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet recognition. He ended his speech with a message he hoped they would carry with them. Sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything. If you find that person, hold on to their encouragement, and if you can, be that person for someone else. As he stepped down from the stage, Daniel felt a sense of peace. He hadn't returned just to inspire the students, he had also needed to reconnect with that part of himself, the boy who once sat in this very school, filled with uncertainty. After the event, a few teachers approached him, expressing their pride in his achievements. One of them mentioned Mrs. Carter, saying she had spoken often of him before her retirement. "Do you know what she used to say about you?" the teacher asked. Daniel shook his head, curious. She said you were the kind of student who reminded her why she became a teacher, that you were proof that every act of kindness matters. The words stayed with Daniel long after he left the school. A few weeks later, Daniel decided to visit Mrs. Carter again, this time unannounced. He arrived at her home on a quiet Sunday afternoon, carrying a simple bouquet of flowers. When she opened the door and saw him, her face lit up with joy. "Daniel! What a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, inviting him inside. They spent hours talking, laughing, and catching up. Daniel shared stories about his work, but what he enjoyed most was listening to Mrs. Carter's stories about her garden, her former students, and the small adventures of her retirement. Before he left, Daniel handed her the flowers and said, "I just wanted to see you again. To remind you that everything I've accomplished started because of you." Mrs. Carter placed a hand on his arm, her eyes glistening. "Daniel, you give me too much credit. You did the hard work. I just gave you a little push." "A little push was everything I needed," he replied with a smile. As he drove away, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for Mrs. Carter, but for the journey they had shared. He realized that the greatest successes in life weren't measured in wealth or achievements, but in the relationships that shaped you and the lives you touched. And Mrs. Carter, sitting in her cozy living room, knew that her life's work had been worth every moment. It wasn't the awards or accolades that mattered, it was the knowledge that she had made a difference, one student at a time. Daniel's visit was a testament to the quiet, transformative power of kindness, a power that would ripple out, touching lives in ways neither of them could fully comprehend. Their story wasn't one of grand gestures or sweeping projects, but of simple, genuine connection. And that, they both knew, was what truly mattered.